This playthrough is rated T for teen.
Chapter 10, Scarlet Star, Los Angeles, December 26, 1980. Huh? My pager? The high-pitched noise pierced the air, restoring him to consciousness. Hyde instinctively tried to reach into his pocket to stop the beeping, and nothing happened. Can't move. His body just wouldn't respond. He felt a searing pain all over, and he realized after a moment that his hands and feet were bound and he was lying on the floor. What happened? His throat stung terribly and his limbs felt heavy. He tried to open his eyes, but pain shot through them. That's right, I got attacked with some kind of sleep spray. Hyde forced himself to endure the pain. When he finally got his eyes open, he focused on a dim light that was shining from the floor. It was the flashlight he had been carrying when he came into the room. It had fallen into the floor when he was assaulted. Slowly, surely, his eyes accustomed themselves to the light, and he started to have a vague idea of his surroundings. First things first, I gotta cut these ropes somehow. He looked around the room and quickly formulated his plan. Struggling to move at all, he shuffled inch by inch towards the wall. By the wall was a table with a ceramic vase stood precariously on top of it. Hyde reached the table at last, and then tried pushing against it. The vase began to wobble. That was all the impetus it needed. He banged against the table again, harder this time, and the vase moved a sizable distance. He pushed his body onto the table leg one last time, and with a loud crash, the vase fell to the ground and smashed into tiny pieces. Taking great care amidst the debris, he picked the fragment that looked the sharpest and tried to cut his ropes. With it, using the fingers of his bond hands. It took far longer than he was expecting, but after an hour of painful effort, he was free at last. Now I'm finally getting somewhere. But who on earth had done this to him? Was Tony alright? Dragging himself off the floor, he picked up the flashlight and tried to find the way out of the room. When he tried opening the door, it wouldn't budge. It felt like there was something on the other side jamming it shut. Gotta get out of here somehow. He had to look around to determine what he might be able to use to break the door. Possible candidates included a wooden chair and a pipe for the bathroom that had been able to pull off because the screw was loose. He kept the pipe in hand in case it was necessary, but he decided the chair was a better option. He picked it up and swung it towards the door with all his might. With a deafening sound, a large hole broke open in the center of the door. He looked down at his feet and saw splinters everywhere. Lying there as well was the nameplate for the door. It read, Manager. So this used to be the manager's room. Interesting. It had been quite an effort, but finally he had managed to escape his prison. Cautiously, he glanced along the corridor to try and gauge the situation. Thankfully, no one was lying in wait. Whoever attacked him appeared to be long gone by now. He could still feel their effect on him, however. His hands and feet ached terribly from the tight bonds. A few yards ahead, he spotted Tony, passed out on the floor. He rushed over to try and rouse him. Clearly, Tony had been attacked with the sleep spray as well. When he came to, he blinked his eyes frantically, desperate to try and dull its effect. Who the hell would want to do this to us, Hyde? He asked, each word raw and painful. My guess it was someone who didn't want us to closing in on the Scarlet Star, said Hyde. But who was it, exactly? He couldn't put his finger on it just yet. Did anything happen to the safe? Asked Tony. Same as when you left, Hyde answered. We need to get back there for another look. No time like the present. Let's book it. Tony still had the crowbar with them, so the two of them went back into room 406. As they made their way through the giant hole in the door, Tony exclaimed, Whoa, did you blow it open with dynamite or something? Hyde just shook his head and made a punching motion. As if you could break the door like that, laughed Tony. The two of them inserted the end of the crowbar in the small gap between the safe and the door. Then, waiting for Tony to say so, they worked in unison, putting in as much strength as could possibly muster. With one determined push, the door broke off its hinges and fell into the floor. It worked! Housed in the safe was a small square case, but when Hyde opened it, there was absolutely nothing inside, Scarlet Star or otherwise. Man, I thought we'd be rolling in it by now, said Tony, dejected. How can a door that thick not be protecting anything? He let out a deep, weary sigh. But Hyde returned his attention to the floor, where the safe door lay broken. The thick slab of metal seemed to be slightly rusted on the inside, and when he looked very closely, he noticed some kind of opening on the surface. He grabbed the crowbar again and pried at the opening, revealing a notebook hidden inside. But it wasn't just any notebook, it was the diary of Michael McGrath, former manager of Hotel Cape West and husband of Kathy, the murder victim sent 13 years ago. The very same man who had known the location of the Scarlet Star Diamond. He opened it and started reading right away. The following was written on it. Written on December 17, 1967, after Kathy's funeral. Kathy, I still can't believe you're gone. Whenever I think of life without you, I'm overcome with an intolerable sense of guilt. Guilt because I know the truth, Kathy. I know why you were killed, and it's because of what happened on that fateful night 12 years ago. If I hadn't shot the safecracker who snuck into my office, if I hadn't taken the Scarlet Star from his dead fingers, then maybe he'd still be alive. Hyde stared down at the page. Scarlet Star, he muttered. That's right. Everything started 25 years ago. He ran on, careful not to miss a single word. When I closed the hotel, my plan was to sever my ties with Condor as well. George said, the only way to escape Condor is to completely disappear. Of course, you're well within your right to do so, but remember this, I can overlook certain things while we're friends, but not when we're strangers. But George knew. He knew about the provisions I'd made in order to start my new life, and he knew that what had become of the Scarlet Star. I expected some sort of retribution, but Kathy, I never imagined it would result in your life being taken. Kathy, I now know exactly what I have to do. I have no intention of handing the Scarlet Star over to George, and absolutely no intention of forgiving him for what he has done either. You can rest easy, Kathy. You will be avenged, I promise. In this notebook, Michael had composed his confession to his wife, Kathy, and his declaration of revenge. It all happened 25 years ago in this very room. My dad came in and attempted to steal the Scarlet Star, only to be killed by the hotel manager, Michael McGrath. At last, the truth had revealed itself to Hyde. Tony tried to get his attention, and Hyde realized he must have been staring into space for quite a while. He decided it was time to leave. He suggested that Tony go back to his room to get some rest since he had been hurt in the attack. Tony nodded in assent and made his way back on his own. The moment Tony had disappeared through the door, Hyde's pager started beeping again. He'd forgotten all about it. The shrill sound that had roused him from the darkness an hour or so beforehand. It was definitely time to give Rachel a call. He hurried back to his room and dialed Rachel's number as quickly as he could. As soon as she realized it was him, she adopted a concerned tone. Is everything okay, Kyle? Apparently she had been paging him over and over again without any kind of response. She had grown rather worried. Hyde did his best to reassure her. Yeah, I got caught up in something and I was a little tied up for a while. But it's fine now, don't worry about it. Hyde's words, particularly the tied up part, gave her pause for a moment, but she was just barely convinced enough to pass the phone over to Ed. Her voice became distant, and he heard her telling Ed that she had finally managed to get in touch with Hyde. She had obviously been quite worried about him. A moment later, his ear was assaulted by Ed's low rumble. Ed's research has led him to discover that 25 years ago, Frank Raver had been heading up an investigation of Condor, which he was then dismissed from. But Hyde, of course, had already learned this, and more from the man himself. He began to tell Ed everything else he had learned. Frank placed the blame for his dismissal squarely in the feet of Hugh Speck, the one who had pulled him away from the front line of his own investigation. Because of that, he had been unable to reveal the link between Condor and Nile, and now he was continuing to investigate Hotel Cape West, the site where Condor had conducted their jewelry trades. But there was more. He told Ed that he had found a diary written by Michael McGrath 13 years ago, and it included a confession. 12 years before that, he had shot and killed a safecracker in the hotel. What? Exclaimed Ed, and it was unusually loud reaction given by his standards. Hyde was also sure now. He explained that the one who had killed Kathy McGrath was his landlady's husband, George Patrice. That's a pretty big reveal you made there, Hyde. Hyde felt like the truth had been a long time in the coming, but it seems I got a bit sloppy too. Just a little while ago, someone sprayed me with sleep spray. What in the hell? You got an idea who could have done this to you? He replied with no hesitation or doubt. Mags. Hyde was practically certain about this. Firstly, the method of attack could definitely have been something a woman would be capable of carrying out. Secondly, she had a connection to Nile and was being watched by them to this day. Finally, she had a lot to hide and had always been wary of his attempts to find out more about the Billion's past. What's your next move? Asked Ed. Let's just say she and I are going to have a little talk. He hung up and began his descent to the lobby. He rapped violently on Mag's door. Who is it? Came the instant reply from inside. It's Kyle Hyde, he growled. What, Mr. Hyde? She was audibly unnerved at hearing his voice. He wasted no time in getting to the heart of the matter. I know what you did. All of it. Now open this damn door. Unsurprisingly, Mags was reluctant to let him in. In fact, she responded in kind. I've also made certain discoveries, Mr. Hyde. I knew you snuck in here and stole the key, for example. She told him that she wouldn't be answering any more of his questions. Hyde had no choice but to abandon this line of inquiry. Hyde was at a loss. He'd been so sure he'd be able to talk to Mags and get her to come clean about everything, but it had all gone up in smoke. How did she find out I snuck into her room anyway? He stood there gazing into the middle distance for a short while. Soon, though, he was joined by Frank, who spoke to Hyde as he was descending the stairs. I may be mistaken, but have you just been to Mrs. Patrice's room? Hyde told Frank that she had somehow learned of his intrusion. Frank's response was unexpected, however. Actually, she called me before you arrived to talk about you. It seems she knew that Frank was a former detective and had a suspicion that Hyde was in league with Nile. Her reasoning, according to Frank, lay in the fact that Hyde had stolen the key with the mark of the condor on it. No one would want to steal the key, she had said, unless they knew what it meant. But how did she know it was me that took it? A suspicion formed in his mind. Are you absolutely sure you didn't drop me in it when you spoke to her? You know you just politely told her that I'd been snooping around in her room? Without missing a beat, Frank flatly replied that he had done nothing of the sort. Then he changed the subject, asking if Hyde had been able to uncover the key's meaning while he was searching on the fourth floor. I didn't get a chance to finish my investigation. I was attacked. He relayed the details of his sleep spray encounter, including the fact that Mags was the likely culprit. Frank sighed as he spoke. I may have made a terrible mistake, Mr. Hyde. When you told me that it was in fact Michael McGrath's son that sent you the order to go searching for the Scarlet Star, I chose to tell you about Michael McGrath's diary. I thought this was a chance to utilize your expertise to help me find evidence that would expose Hugh Speck and his corruption. But as a result, Frank continued, Hyde had been attacked by Mags. Frank regretted this deeply. Hyde, however, was less concerned. Don't flatter yourself, Frank. You think I was doing what I was told? I went to Mag's room to help me uncover the truth of 25 years ago. Simple as that. The truth of 25 years ago? Frank furrowed his brow. I want to know about what went on in the manager's office, about the safecracker's death, and I'm not interested in the Scarlet Star itself. Frank's eyes widened in shock. Mr. Hyde, if you're keen on hearing more about 25 years ago, feel free to join me in my room. Instead of leaving Hyde in suspense, Frank went back up to the stairs. Frank's face went white as a sheet when I mentioned my dad. Hyde didn't hesitate for long. He needed to know everything about what had happened 25 years ago. He needed to know it now. He followed Frank up to the third floor and pressed the buzzer on his door. Well, here I am, Frank, he said once the old man came to greet him. Now talk. Frank invited him in. If Hyde wasn't mistaken, this room was slightly smaller than his own. There wasn't a single item of furniture in it that didn't serve a functional purpose. Cindy from the cafe kindly gave me some coffee not long ago, Frank said, heading towards the kitchen. Would you care for some? He started preparing the coffee. Hyde felt the room in a bit of lifeless air about it, like it couldn't be someone's home. There was a picture frame on the chest of drawers by Frank's bed. The photograph was of a younger Frank, his wife, and his 2 children. Frank returned and placed 2 warm mugs of coffee on the table. A fine aroma filled the room. You're the only person who's been in here and had a coffee with me. Noticing Hyde's glances towards the photographs, Frank talked a little bit about his family. His wife had passed away 10 years earlier after a long battle with illness, he explained, and he hadn't seen either of his children in several years. As Frank went on, Hyde started to grow annoyed with him. He wouldn't have said he was angry exactly, but he had certainly felt the man had made some thoughtless decisions. Frank, as of yet fruitless quest to restore his name, wasn't just his own problem. It affected his entire family. All of them would have sympathized. But Frank had told them nothing, and now here he was, aged and alone, still sniffing out clues. When Hyde made his accusations clear to Frank, the latter's eyes grew dark. You clearly don't understand all, Mr. Hyde. I didn't leave my family in the dark all this time just for the sake of my own pride. There's more to it than that. My name wasn't the only thing lost during the Quattro case. The whole mess resulted in someone's death. Hyde could make an educated guess as to who Frank meant. The person who lost their life. You must be talking about the safecracker. He was right on the money. Frank, I want you to tell me about the safecracker who was killed here 25 years ago. Tell me everything you know. Frank described the circumstances in which they had met. The safecracker, Gregory as Frank called him, had been introduced to him by a contact he always used. Gregory? Asked Hyde, decidedly puzzled by this piece of information. Who's Gregory? That was just an alias. I seriously doubt his real name, just something used while working. Gregory had been a renowned safecracker, and he had never once been caught by the police. He also knew a great deal about Condor. Frank came up with the idea of using the safecracker as a part of his own plan, so he made an agreement with Gregory, who then snuck into the hotel. But his grand plan to catch Condor by fair means or foul had all come to naught. Pure vitriol dripped from Frank's tongue as he spoke the name of the one responsible. Hugh Speck put it into it all. By fair means or foul, so what was his plan exactly? First, though, Hyde asked Frank exactly what Hugh Speck had done to thwart his intentions. Frank's rage finally boiled to the surface as he thundered, He did something beyond words. Hyde wanted to hear all the details, but just thinking about it seemed to leave Frank too emotional to even form the words properly, so he went back to his primary concern. There's still something I need to ask about what you told me just now. Hyde explained that he still needed to know more about the safecracker. Frank's composure returned, and he told an irritated Hyde, If you're a former detective, then ask me the right questions. Make me talk. Does he think he's hazing a new recruit or something? If this was the only way, then he would have to go along with it. His desire to know what happened 25 years ago had just burned too strongly. It was now or never. His first question for the old man was, What was your plan from 25 years ago to catch Condor? Frank replied, I decided there was only one way to bring Condor to justice, and that was to catch them in the act. Skilled as Condor was in conducting systematic thefts as jewelers, Frank explained, they were also adept at turning their acquisitions into near untraceable cash. But Frank had managed to find out from a staff member that Hotel Cape West was the site they used to conduct their trade, and that the jewels were kept in a safe in the manager's office. If I could positively identify that the jewels were being stored there where what Condor stole, I would have all the proof I needed to drive the final nail into Condor's coffin. So the plan, shady as it seemed to Hyde, was to have Gregory break open the safe, send a signal so the police officers waiting on standby could go into the office and confiscate the stolen jewels. Out of curiosity, Hyde asked, "What kind of signal you decide he should send you?" "We planned to use the window. As soon as Gregory had confirmed the jewel's presence, he would shine a flashlight out the window to notify Frank, who would be waiting outside the hotel." The operation didn't go quite according to plan, however. The police were unable to step in, and Gregory was never to leave the building alive. So what went wrong? This is the most pressing question on Hyde's mind. "You're telling me he never returned the signal you're waiting for?" "No, I believe he sent it, but..." "But what?" Frank stopped there. Beyond that point, there were certain things he couldn't discuss, he said. They related to a promise he had made with a man called Gregory. Bitterly, he added that if he had just managed to keep his promise, Gregory wouldn't have had to die. "I regret what happened. I doubt I'll ever outlive that regret. But there's only one person I can imagine telling this whole story to, and that person is a relative of Gregory." Hyde's lingering doubts manifested themselves only for a brief second, but he knew he couldn't stop at this point. He asked one of his other questions. "What kind of agreement did you have with Gregory?" Frank was happy to answer this question. It seemed that Gregory wanted to wash his hands of the safe-cracking business, but he couldn't cut his ties to his former associates. In exchange for his cooperation, Frank was to make certain incidents from Gregory's past disappear, and the police would have made sure that any ties to the criminal world were all well and truly severed. But Gregory had been against the idea at first, so Frank had tried a different approach. As a kind of advance payment, he gave Gregory the key to a new car. Back then, it was commonplace in operations like this, offering things like this to people who assisted us, I mean. Then Hyde presented the next question that had been building in him. "So what happened to you?" Frank said that Hugh Speck had revealed his plan to Condor, and that the same night something had happened to him. Remembering it was clearly making him very agitated, he simply continued, "But I don't see how that has anything to do with you." "What if I were to bring you a member of Gregory's family here?" said Hyde. "Would you be willing to tell them everything?" "Naturally, but I hardly think it would be possible for you to do so." Hyde made a beeline for his own room, where the package his mother had sent him still lay on the coffee table. Nestled inside was the car key that seemed so mysterious. "So it's Frank who gave this key to my dad." He picked it up and went straight to Frank's room. "So where's the member of Gregory's family, Mr. Hyde?" Frank asked impatiently. "Right here. Me." And he handed the key to Frank, the very same key the man had given Gregory 25 years prior. "This was discovered on the body of a man in a downtown parking lot 25 years ago. It's one of the items my dad left me." Frank made no effort to hide his abject shock at the revelation that Gregory's son was right there before his eyes. He wouldn't have been able to even if he had tried. He was truly at a loss for words. Gregory's real name was Chris Hyde. After deciding to wash his hands of crime, he left the house on his final job. His body turned up 3 days later, and the case remained unsolved to this day. Though doing his best to suppress his anger, Hyde nonetheless took out some of his bitterness and frustration on Frank. Frank's eyes took on a gloomy pallor. The shock and regret were tangible. "When we made our promise, he looked me directly in the eyes and said, 'Can I really trust you?' I didn't answer, but just nodded. I never intended that nod to be a lie, but..." And now at last, Frank described exactly what happened on the last night of Chris Hyde's life. As per their agreement, Gregory had broken into the hotel manager's room and cracked the safe. He saw the jewelry with his own eyes and shone a flashlight out the window of the darkened room, transmitting the signal just as he was supposed to. But no matter how many times Gregory shone his flashlight, he received no response, no backup, because Frank wasn't there. That night, Speck gave Frank a note informing him that his wife's condition had worsened and that he should go to the hospital to be with her. Frank left Speck to preside over the scene and went straight to the hospital. He quickly realized that he had been set up and rushed back, but Speck had just said, "That note? I was just passing it on to you. I didn't even know what it said," and he insisted they had never seen any kind of signal through the window. He later found out from one of the other officers on the scene, who had kept quiet in front of the boss, that the signal had been transmitted after all, and Speck had simply ignored it. Speck was behind it all. Frank had realized it when Speck's internal investigation led to him being dragged away from the Condor case. "Please, Mr. Hyde, are you able to forgive me? If only I had known that Speck was working with Condor all those years ago, I would never have left him in charge of the scene, and maybe your father would still be alive today." Now that he knew all the facts, Hyde couldn't bring himself to blame Frank for what had happened. In fact, his most immediate feeling was just to wonder how his father must have felt in those final moments. Tell me one thing, asked Frank. "When did you find out that your father died in these very apartments?" He told Frank that it was only very recently when he had learned that Will was Michael McGrath's son and happened upon Michael's diary. But Hyde was forced to dash Frank's hope. Nothing in the diary had much of anything to do with Hugh Speck. Frank also expressed an interest in chatting to Will, but he was long gone by now. Frank's shoulders sank. "Don't take it so hard. I'll find you the proof you need to nail Speck." Hyde declared that he would expose all the secrets lurking in the building's past. "All you need to do is keep your nose out and wait for me to get it done. You stay out of the line of fire. Leave the dangerous stuff to me." Frank agreed to leave the rest up to Hyde. Then he rummaged in his pocket and produced a torn section of a postcard, which he gave to Hyde. There was no mistaking it. It belonged to the same postcard as the piece he had found in Will's room. This item represents the only clue I found while searching the fourth floor. Take it with you. It might help. Incidentally, are you still eager to hear what Miss Patrice has to say? Hyde nodded and said, Damn right I am. Frank promised he would make sure Max understood that Hyde wasn't in league with Niall. Before leaving, Hyde had one last thing he needed to know. Tell me, Frank, what kind of man was my dad? We had a drink together once, Frank reminisced. I remember thinking to myself at the time he was a lot tougher than he looked. He never had much to say, but what he did say, he said with the utmost poignancy. He told me about his kid wanting to be a baseball star when he grew up. After they finished talking, Hyde left Frank's room and made an attempt at matching up with the two parts of the postcard. Together they formed a picture of the moon. He turned it over and the writing on the back looked like some kind of codex. Couldn't derive any clear meaning from it, however. He decided his next move was to pay another visit to his charming landlady. Knocking on her door produced a response at first, but this time he wasn't about to give up so easily. He kept knocking over and over until she acknowledged it. Who is it? Came her voice at last. It's Kyle Hyde. We need to talk about Miss Patrice, Miss Patrice, about Michael McGrath and the diary you left behind. There was a long pause before she answered again. Finally, the uncertain voice said, I see you very well. She opened the door and let him in. It soon became clear, however, that the mood between them was still acrimonious. Without any prompting, both of them explained, Why'd you do such a thing? Hyde was referring to the sleep spray, of course, and Mag to him stealing the key from her room. Both of them just glared at each other for a moment. Then Mag said, Dylan warned me about you. He told me I should be extra vigilant when you're around. Miss Patrice, Dylan has been watching you on behalf of his employer, Niall, and not just you either. He's been also watching one of the other tenants whose relatives worked for Condor. Mags was interested to know who he was talking about, but he assured her that for her own good it was better that it remained in the dark, provided she wanted nothing more to do with Condor at least. There was still a key detail Mags didn't understand, though. I still have no idea about you, Mr. Hyde. Exactly how do you figure in all this? Me? Well, He drew a bet. I'm the son of the safecracker killed here 25 years ago in the manager's office. Upon hearing this, Mags was struck dumb. She just stared back at him in shock. I told you before, didn't I? My dad was killed when I was 9 years old. The case is still unsolved to this day, you remember? 25 years ago, my dad got caught up in a police operation to cover the secret sales of Hotel Cape West that had only been set up by Condor. I only found out that he died here after he gave everyone the eviction notice. Mags broke her silence. And how exactly did you come to know all this? He told her that he had learned it from a person connected to Condor who lived in that very building. This person had also told him that his father had broken in 25 years ago to steal the Scarlet Star, and that the diamond had disappeared that very night. These revelations had prompted Hyde to dig into the past and bring all the building's secrets to light, and that was why he had snuck into her room. He had a question for her now. Just how much do you know about Condor? Mags replied, I've got no interest in talking to you about that. But Hyde wasn't going to let her off that easy. Is it because your husband was a Condor ringleader? She made no effort to deny this. Yes, that's precisely the reason. You see, after he entered his hands, he couldn't play the saxophone anymore. He changed. Mags told Hyde about how George Patrice got his first job courtesy of a customer who came into one of the cafes he owned. After it went well, he began to realize that he was in too deep to turn back. Before too long, he made a name for himself within Condor and become a ringleader. The time had finally come for Hyde to ask the question that Will had been so desperately to have answered. Who was it that killed Kathy McGrath 13 years ago? It was George. He said it was payback for Michael double-crossing him. George and Michael conducted their illicit trades in the hotel using a genius system they'd thought up together. George stole the jewels, but instead of keeping them on hand himself, he gave them to Michael, the manager of Hotel Cape West. Michael then kept them secretly in the safe until George contacted him to let him know that a sale had been arranged. The buyers would pose as guests, staying at the hotel, and the jewels and money would change hands there. George would then take immediate receipt of the cash and give Michael his cut. So the hotel parties were to find people to buy the jewelry, asked Hyde. Exactly. The parties would be held from time to time at the hotel. There, potential buyers would gather and the process would begin in earnest. But, she clarified, the trades never took place in the guest rooms. There was a hidden room in the hotel for the express purpose. As for the murder of Kathy McGrath, it had its origins in Michael's betrayal 25 years ago. When George had received word that someone was going to break into the safe, he contacted Michael and told him to protect it at all costs. Inside the safe was a diamond that was still waiting a buyer, the Scarlet Star. An intruder appeared just as anticipated, and Michael shot and killed him. They hid the body in a chest freezer, then moved it to a downtown parking lot 2 days later. That man was Hyde's father. Following the incident, Michael insisted that the Scarlet Star had disappeared. He said it was already missing from the safe when he shot the safecracker. George never openly admitted that he doubted Michael's word. He knew that if he did, he would lose his perfect venue for selling his stolen jewelry. And then 12 years later, George killed Kathy. He did it because Michael had decided to close down the hotel and sever all ties with Condor, in other words, to get out of the illegal jewel trading business altogether. There was one more reason. It was because he had grown tired of Kathy's company. George and Kathy had been intimate in an act which had betrayed both Michael and myself. Going into detail about all this had clearly taken a lot out of Mags. She exhaled slightly, letting her shoulders slump. But Hyde pressed on. You mentioned the hidden chamber used to sell the stolen goods. Do you know where it is? Sadly, it was not as simple as that. Mags said she had searched for it herself, even when the hotel was being renovated, but had never been able to find it. However, she was certain that the key he had taken from her room was in fact the key to the hidden chamber. I think we've covered just about everything, Mr. Hyde, she added. Not so fast, there's still a few holes left. Mags was willing to continue talking, but only under one condition. Mr. Hyde, even though I own this building, there's still something I have yet to find. I want you to find it for me. She's referring, of course, to the hidden chamber. Hyde agreed to her terms, and she gave him 2 items she thought would help him locate it. One was a photograph of the hotel from when it had just opened, and the other was a tiny key. There was one more thing she handed to him. It was a single sheet of paper, which she said had been kept in a secure place along with the Condor key. It looked like a map of the 4th floor, but had red circles marked on it in 6 places. There was also a single cross drawn on it in some red color. Some words were scrawled in the corner as well. The far side of the moon. How you use the things I've handed it is entirely up to you, said Mags. That aside, he promised her that he'd find the hidden chamber no matter what. Now hold on a moment. Don't I have another photo of the hotel? He finished around his pocket and got out the photograph from 13 years ago. He put it side by side with the one Mags had just given him and scrutinized them for any differences that might prove helpful. There it was, a small round window that had only present in the older photo. By 1967 it had disappeared. Hyde observed that the hidden chamber would most likely have to be situated between the elevator and the room 405, but he had no idea where the entrance was. No doubt he'd be able to find some clues on the 4th floor. He had a good feeling about this. And so Hyde made his way up to the 4th floor, bringing the keys with him. His first step was to perform one more top-to-bottom search of all rooms. He decided to start from the furthest room on the right, 401, and go around in order. Flashlight in hand, he entered room 401 and shone a light into every corner. He noticed something curious about the large bed in the center of the far wall. One of the bed props had a condor mark on it. He copied it into his notebook, exactly as it appeared. This symbol has to mean something, Hyde said aloud to himself. Next was room 402, where he found a similar mark on the inside of the closet door. In 403, it was on the leg of an old chair. 404 had it on its side of an old desk. The edge of a dresser mirror was where he found it in room 405. And finally, it was carved in the window at the end of the 4th floor corridor. Each was slightly different, and he made sure to copy them down accurately in his notebook. While he was in room 405, he also had a quick look at the wall that, at least judging by the photograph, had the hidden chamber on the other side. Nothing about it seemed especially out of the ordinary, however. What could he do from here? He took a look back at the drawings he had just made in his notebook, but nothing useful left out of him. He also tried comparing it to the codex on the back of the moon postcard, but he still couldn't hope to make sense of it all. It was time to investigate the one place left, the elevator. He got in and then once more compared the codex to the various condor marks. Suddenly, his gaze brushed the elevator's control buttons, and it all started to fall into place. That's it! The panels had buttons for every floor, but the space where the 4th button should have been was covered up, and the cover had a small keyhole. It looked just about the right size for the key Mags had given him. He put the key into the lock and turned it to the right. The cover came off, and unexpectedly the 4th floor button along with it. Both dropped to the floor, leaving a hole with a switch inside it. Hyde tried turning it on. Next, he realized he would have to press some of the buttons in the control panel. He looked down at his notebook and used it in conjunction with the codex on the postcard to determine the buttons he was supposed to press and the order he was supposed to do it in. He followed the instructions exactly. The instant his hand came off the last button, the elevator started to move. Then it stopped just as quickly. There was a loud clunk behind him, and he turned around and noticed that a flap had opened on the side of the bench in the corner of the elevator. Inside was another keyhole. Fraught with tension, Hyde inserted the condor key and turned it into the lock. A much larger hole opened up in the bench, and it looked very much like an entrance. Hyde bent down and crawled into the hidden chamber. The room was dim and thick with dust. A poker table sat in the center, and by one of the walls was a desk with a single closed drawer and a lamp perched on top of it. On top of the desk was some kind of notebook. Hyde flicked through the pages and saw that the details inside appeared to be records of all the illegal jewelry trades Condor conducted. He opened the drawer as well and found an old brown envelope inside, in which was an LAPD badge and a photograph depicting 3 men, one of whom was wearing a hat. It's him! It's George Patrice! The man on the right was indeed George Patrice. Beside him sat someone else, someone Hyde had definitely seen before. That's right, he realized, is the mayoral candidate he had seen on the television, Hugh Speck, albeit much younger. Finally on the left was Michael McGrath. This is all the evidence I need. It proves that Hugh Speck was in league with Condor. Step by step, he felt like he was closing in on the truth. Next, his interest was captured by a painting on the wall, depicting a ship drifting on the waves and a lighthouse showing in the way. At the start, he glimpsed a light switch directly below the flame. He flicked it on. Wow, that's bright! A single dazzling array of light beamed out from the lighthouse in the painting and onto the opposing wall. He followed the light with his eyes, and on the other wall, it illuminated a frame containing 4 playing cards, the aces, all in a row. Amidst the light was a shadow in the shape of a condor. The condor's beak pointed towards the ace of diamonds. The light from the lighthouse. Surely this can't be. Suddenly it hit him. It was directing him into the Scarlet Star's hiding place. He stepped onto the roof, where the glow from the window of surrounding buildings lit up the evening. He discovered that the lighthouse on the roof had also been switched on, casting another condor shadow across the ground and onto a nearby brick wall. The shadow seemed to point to one brick in particular that was visible newer than the others. Hyde picked up the nearby rock and tried bashing the brick with it. He pounded it over and over again, chipping away the brickwork bit by bit, exposing the diamond beneath. The size of it was immense. It was by far the largest diamond Hyde had ever seen. "This is it," he whispered breathlessly. "Scarlet Star." He took it into his hands. Here it was, the diamond his father had been grasping the moment he died. He didn't even know he was doing it, but when Hyde thought about his father's murder, his hand clenched tightly around the diamond. This precious stone linked the two men together. It transcended time, made the 25 years that had passed simply pale into insignificance. A father's final moments and his son's hard-won fight to learn the truth, all encapsulated into this single gem. It was worth more than money to him, more than words. He felt like it might all melt away the instant he let go. As he gripped the Scarlet Star, a distant memory of his father's large, strong hands emerged from the depths of his consciousness. He wasn't sure how long he stood there. Eventually, though, it was just time to go inside again. But just as he was about to, the elevator came up and someone stepped out. It was Mags. "I assume I have you to blame for switching the lighthouse light on, do I?" Hyde nodded, but from that alone, Mags knew that he had entered the hidden chamber. And that meant she knew that the switch under the picture frame worked the light on the lighthouse monument. Something wasn't quite right. Mags couldn't possibly know all this if she hadn't been in the hidden chamber herself. That room was where her husband George had committed innumerable crimes. He would have expected she'd never want to go in there, but clearly she knew all about it. "Why'd you lie to me?" he asked. "You told me you didn't know about where it was." Mags stated that she had never had any intention of discussing that room with anyone, but when you started asking such specific questions, I knew I wouldn't be able to keep at it for secret for long. Every detail of Patrice's diary dealing with quite literally hidden inside the building's walls. That was why Mags had only agreed to sell on the condition that it would be demolished. George's legacy would finally be able to die. But Hyde had gotten in the way of that. He had dug up the secrets buried in the Cape West and brought the past under scrutiny. So I had to decide on one thing. I could leave while everything was still shrouded in secrecy, or I could risk letting everything come to light. It was essentially a gamble. "What do you mean a gamble?" "A gamble to see if you'd be able to find that room or not." Hyde asked how she had expected the gamble to pay off. She replied, "I was fully aware that there was little hope I'd be keeping everything secret. I knew that if anyone could find that room, it would be you." "That's the impression she got," she elaborated, when she had looked into his eyes and seen how much it meant to him. "And I decided that if you happened upon the room, I would lose my gamble and I would need to let you in on everything I knew." Let him in on everything. Those words provoked a question in Hyde. "So what is it you've been trying to hide?" "The crimes that he committed, of course," she declared. Her late husband's status as Condor's ringleader, the fact that the hotel had been used to sell the stolen jewels, the involvement of the LAPD officer, and the murder of a colleague's wife as payback for her betrayal. The sum of colleague Patrice's crimes was a hefty one indeed, and Mags had hidden it all. "I was planning to take these truths with me to the grave, but as soon as we can both see, that proved futile. Maybe I knew, Mr. Hyde, even as you arrived at my room, I knew that what was about to happen, somewhere deep down, I must have realized that you would recover the whole thing." She asked if he thought he'd found everything that had been lost in that place. "Yeah, I think I have. Michael's diary from 13 years ago, the evidence linking Condor to the LAPD, and the Scarlet Star, all of them were in his possession." On that note, he showed her the Scarlet Star. Your late husband didn't take the disappearance of it lightly and killed Kathy as a result. Yes, the Scarlet Star going missing was where this whole horrible ordeal began. "Not quite," submitted Hyde. "It actually all started not when the diamond had disappeared, but when Condor had stolen it in the first place. If George Patrice were still alive, I'd be showing this thing to him and we'd be having a very frank chat about his crimes. I'm sure you would, other Mags almost in a whisper, but as long as he's no longer with us, that will never happen. She added, incidentally, everything you found is as good as yours. That included the Scarlet Star and everything he'd found in the hidden chamber. She asked him to dispose of it all however he wished. And with that out of the way, Mags continued, okay then, I suppose it's time for me to tell you everything. Mags looked him straight in the eye. Hyde had never looked so intently into her eyes before, but he saw now how beautiful they were and how much honesty they projected. Will you listen to what I have to say, Mr. Hyde? All of it? Will you let me tell you about my foolishness in loving an evil man? Mags had met George when she was just 19 years old. She was a dancer and he was part of a band. I knew from the start that he was a bad person. He used to have a different woman on his arm every time she saw him, and he'd always hang around in suspicious company, but she fell in love with him nonetheless, and I soon knew that I'd need to get used to dealing with times I loved him and times I detested him. As strange as things was, the more I became accustomed to the jealousy I felt, the more my desire towards him grew. It was a very strange position to be in. Even when he started dipping his hands into the world of crime, she loved him enough that she became an accomplice, and their feelings of guilt became a chain that bound them together. It was inevitable, however, that such a bond would not stand the test of time. She knew that well enough that she didn't make a fuss even when George and Kathy eventually betrayed her and Michael by sleeping together. And after he had killed Kathy, a weak, bitter smile emerged on George's face, and he had said, "Yeah, did it? Guess that's just one more secret the two of us have to keep, dollface." That was when Mags first realized what mistake she had made. In part, I was responsible for the man he'd become. She had hardened her resolve. She knew that she was the only one who could possibly stop him. And so, on that day, I planned to shoot him using his own gun. But in an ironic twist, Michael shot him instead that very same night. When she saw him, he'd struck her on the head with the gun. She lost consciousness, and when she woke up, her right hand was gripping the gun George had been shot with. George's body lay right before her eyes, and as she stared at his contorted expression of pain, she decided that she had enough of all of it. As for her husband, she knew that this was nothing more than he deserved. I made one final promise to him then. I vowed that I would keep a secret even after his death and not tell a soul. I intended to take them with me on to the next life, but from then on, I felt very much like a lost ship at sea with no lighthouse to guide me home. I drifted aimlessly in the darkness, tossing endlessly by the waves. Mags was arrested under suspicion of killing her husband, but never breathed a word about Michael's involvement. It was because she had wanted to be found guilty. Such was not to be, however. The court found her innocent and all charges were dropped. With the money George had left her, Mags had bought the hotel, started leasing out the rooms as apartments. I thought that if I lived here, perhaps the lighthouse would be my guide and help me traverse the waves and survive the darkness. Looking back, maybe I was just clinging on to my foolish ideals. But the fact remains, I failed in my attempt to keep what he did secret, and that brings us right back to here and now, where I'm telling you everything. And that was the end of her story. I expect you're overwhelmed with anger at this foolish woman's confession, am I right? I really wish I hadn't needed to tell you anybody what I've told you. In a subdued humor, Hyde answered, You're kidding, right? Surely you've been hoping to offload this entire thing onto somebody for years. Hyde felt like nobody could keep such dark secrets pent up for so long without wanting to let it all out. I admit, you're right. I've been languishing in my guilt for what seems like an eternity. I just wanted to put my love for another ahead of my own feelings. I never thought doing so much could lead to this much turmoil. Every word burned in her throat. She was on the verge of tears. It's true, I've been feeling like this for quite some time now. I really want somebody to sit down and talk to. Mags collapsed to the floor and began sobbing, her head in her hands. Hyde's mind turned to all the people out there in the world who must be forced to bear painful burdens. It occurred to him that he was one of them. Even knowing the truth behind what had happened to his father couldn't erase the pain of it all. So he knew that it was the same for Mags. She had admitted everything, told him her darkest secrets, but the burden would never disappear completely. Even so, maybe letting it all out would help. Perhaps the more she cried, the lighter the burden would become. Hyde stood in patient silence until her tears had run dry. A chill wind was blowing across the roof. He offered her his hand to help her up, but she refused to offer. I can stand on my own. I have never needed anybody's help, and I have no intention of changing that now. She stood up on her own, her eyes dry. Her glance then darted to the lighthouse and its dazzling beam. She stared up at it. Soon we'll be leaving this lighthouse behind forever. I wonder if it would be okay without it to guide me through the darkness. Hyde offered no reply. He merely joined her in gazing up at the lighthouse. Mags left him there on his own and descended back into the building. Hyde didn't particularly feel like going back to his room just yet. Instead, he went just one floor down into room 406, where he'd opened the curtains and looked out the window. Through the long years of dust and grime, he saw a darkened, rain-drenched cityscape that was very familiar to him. Naturally, it wasn't quite the same view his father had seen, but now that 25 years had passed, Hyde was the same age his father had been when he died, and here he was, standing in the same room, staring out the same window. What had his father seen through his window in those final moments? How must he have felt when he realized that no one was coming to answer his signal? Even now, with the truth of that night unveiled, Hyde could never be so sure exactly what had been running through his father's head. One thing was certain, at least. As his father stood by the window, he had known he was doing it for the sake of his wife and child. Hyde drew the curtains closed. It was time to let his father's memory rest. The next morning, Hyde was woken up by the telephone. When he dutifully picked it up, the voice on the other end said, "Morning, Kyle." It was his mother, Jeannie. "I got a call from Ed last night. He told me everything. Seems like you've been keeping things from me." Not knowing exactly what he meant exactly, he offered a vague apology. "Why didn't you tell me yourself?" she insisted. "I mean, Ed going to the hospital is pretty serious and all." So that's what she was talking about, Hyde realized. She continued, "Ed told me something nice too, though. He said you're not the good friend that he used to be." She sounded very proud of her son. Hyde didn't feel much like telling his mother everything he learned about his father in the past few days, but he knew it was a conversation he would need to have at some point, so he hinted at the subject. "Listen, Mom, you remember that chat we had a couple days ago, the one about why you and Dad were together?" She hadn't forgotten. "Well, I've been doing some thinking about that since then, about Dad. If I could put his crimes in the past, I'd like to come and visit you. Maybe then we could tell me some more about him." "I'd be happy to, Kyle." He put the phone down and went over to the wash basin where he turned on the tap and splashed some cold water in his face. He put on his favorite suit and decided he should give Rachel a call. "I'm done with that order," he told her. "You mean you found the item?" "Yeah, that and the truth from 25 years ago." She offered to pass him over to Ed, but he said he'd rather come into the office in person and talk to him about it. She told him she'd be waiting. First, though, he paid a visit to Frank so he could give the man the items he'd been searching for with such determination. Hyde told Frank about the hidden chamber and the evidence he'd found there. "This is a ledger containing the details of the jewels sales the Condor made. Here's a picture showing Hugh Speck together with Condor and an LAPD police badge." Overwhelmed with the emotion, Frank expressed his gratitude. Now he'd finally be able to bring down the man he'd been after for all these years. He went back into his room with a sense of wonder about him. Well, that ties that one up. Having dealt with that, he resolved to finally go to an estate agent in hopes of finding somewhere to move to. He made his way to the first floor. Once he got to the lobby, he was greeted by Claire, the waitress from Lucky's Cafe. "Good morning, Mr. Hyde." "What's up? You seem chirpier than usual, if that's possible." And she had good reason. Her mother was right there right now talking to her father, and they were getting along really well. In fact, it was looking very much like they might get back together. Claire could hardly contain her excitement. "And I've got you to thank for this, Mr. Hyde." He had to admit to her he wasn't really sure what he'd done to help. As if it was the most obvious thing in the world, she said, "Well, you and Dad talked about it, didn't you? You told him a few families actually managed to get back together and that there were lots that really want to but simply can't." Hyde didn't really remember, but he thought it sounded like something he'd say. Sydney's voice bellowed from the direction of the cafe. He was looking for Claire. The door opened with a click and Sydney walked out, his face marked by a despairing scowl. "Dad, where's Mom?" asked Claire. "It's no use, Claire. I don't think I can handle it on my own. I run out of things to say when it's just the two of us." Claire's tone was soft and caring. "Mom's not expecting the world, you know. Just take it slowly and try not to get flustered. Don't try to rush through it. Enjoy the time you both have together." She went back into the cafe, a spring in her step. "This whole thing isn't as easy as it looks," muttered Sydney awkwardly. "Sydney, I think you'd better do what Claire says. After all, these things take time." "I suppose you're right," he sighed. "I'll give it my best shot." Hyde could hazard a guess that Sydney still had no idea how things would proceed from here, but he knew from the determined expression on the man's face that he would do nothing short of his best. Sydney went back to the cafe, and Hyde instantly found himself in the company of Tony, who called out, "Yo, Hyde!" Hyde couldn't help but notice Tony was carrying his guitar in one hand, and Tony clarified, "Got me a job, a real gig. I've been signed up to play for today for a whole week, you know." The owner of the video had heard his song on the radio, Tony explained, but Tony still had one last niggling doubt. On the last day, the owner wanted him to play something new, but he couldn't come up with anything. Hyde refused to mince words. "Cut the crap. Stop worrying about it. Just do it." Tony's jaw practically dropped, but Hyde went on regardless. "I'm pretty sure that if you put your mind to it, you can write something new. You know how tough life can get. You've got a nice girl. You've even been knocked out. Surely you've got no end of subject matter to work with." Tony found his resolve and nodded firmly. "I'll give it a shot." Over the past few days, Tony had grown into a stronger person. Of that, Hyde was sure. Hyde asked how Tony was after the previous night. He certainly seemed like he was over the worst of it. Hey, that reminds me. How about you? How'd the treasure hunt go? Asked Tony. Hyde hastily made up a story about how the whole thing had been just a big scam. Damn, that's rough. So I guess all our dreams about becoming stinky rich have gone up in smoke, huh? Tony's voice must have caught Mag's attention as she emerged from her apartment and asked, Mr. Wolf, I was just curious to hear when you'll be setting the amount of rent you still owe me. Oh, I'm sorry about that, but it's cool, because I'm going to pay you off all of it soon. I've got some work that's going to be bringing in the cash, so don't you worry, you'll get your rent soon enough. He seemed more confident about it than usual, so she took him at his word and asked him to come and see her as soon as he had the money. Tony rushed off to get to his gig on time. When he was gone, Max commented, He's somewhat different from before, wouldn't you say? Hyde certainly couldn't deny it. He felt the same way. She went on. He managed to look me in the eye and tell me straight, much more confident. I feel much more inclined to believe what he says when his attitude is like that. I wonder what brought on this sudden change. Hyde told her that, in his view, the same applied to her. Like you, he's been weighed under by problems and couldn't get any help. Now he's overcome with that, and you've seen the results. There was something he wanted to ask her as well. Miss Patrice, what are you going to do with yourself after you leave this place? She smiled warmly. Part of me wants to just get out of here, maybe on a cruise, somewhere where there's a lighthouse to guide us at night. What do you think, Mr. Hyde? Maybe you'd care to join me? Having extended this invitation, she went back to her usual formal self and recalled, Incidentally, it's only you and Mr. Wolf are yet to decide a new place to live. I'd really appreciate it if you got to move on it. There's still a lot on my plate to take care of without having you two to worry about, though I'm sure you appreciate that more than others would. And leaving him on that note, she went back inside her room. A wry grin crept into his face as he watched her go. Maybe she hasn't changed so much after all. Right, he thought. Now he was finally going to set off and find himself a new apartment. But before he could move another inch, his pager suddenly beeped urgently. As he pressed the button to silence it, he realized he'd sold just about everything he could in the apartment building he called home. He pulled the handle on the front door and took a step into the outside world. He checked in a few estate agents, but nothing really caught his eye. Every apartment in town seemed to have some aspect or other that didn't suit him. Still, he could come back to that. For now, he headed over to Red Crown like he promised Rachel. Felt like forever since he'd been in the office with Ed and Rachel. It was a little awkward, actually. So, did you find it? Boomed Ed. What were you looking for? Hyde knew exactly what Ed was getting at. He proceeded to tell them the whole story, everything that happened to his father, Chris, on the night of his death. When he was finished, his two listeners sat in a stunned silence for a moment or two. Then Ed murmured, Hyde, I've got to ask, are you okay? I'm always worried about your old man, your old man had a son who's too busy sorting out other people's problems to ever deal with his own. Hyde had learned from his mother that Ed was the kind of police officer who'd given them the bad news after his father's body was discovered in a downtown parking lot. Ed decided to tell Hyde about the time he and Chris first met. It had happened in a rowdy bar where his youthful exuberance, Ed had downed a few too many. Chris kept him in check that night when his spirits were getting a bit too high for their own good, and they ended up meeting again on the same bar from time to time. They never spoke all that much about their respective backgrounds, but when Chris started to feel the alcohol, he'd talk a little bit about his loving wife, who worked as a nurse, and his sweet young son, who was, he'd said, perhaps a bit too kind-hearted for his own good. Then, for a while, Ed had been too busy with work to see Chris, and the next time he'd seen his friend's face, it was that fateful night in the parking lot. Ed asked Rachel to get him another cup of coffee. After she'd served the coffee, Rachel returned to her seat and backtracked a little to what they'd been discussing earlier. Kyle, do you reckon that Frank guy will be able to expose Hugh Speck now? Ed answered in Hyde's place. Frank will do whatever it takes. After first deliberately messing up the Condor investigation, Hugh Speck had concocted an internal investigation that led to Frank being pulled off the case entirely. But as Ed explained, though, Frank's heavy-handed techniques and predisposition towards violence led many to criticize him, Frank seldom failed to catch his man. His determination to fight the good fight had even taken him away from his family. Instead of maintaining a happy home life, he focused all his efforts on improving arrest rates. When his wife was taken ill, he knew that all had to change. That now was the time to try and rebuild his fractured relationships with his family. When he'd wrapped up the Condor case, he was planning to take his first ever vacation since joining the force so that he could be by his wife's side. Ironically, getting pulled away from active duty did give him a lot of free time, but his wife, knowing all about the internal investigation, grew despondent and soon left this earthly world. He ultimately failed to rekindle things with his children as well. In listening to Ed's story, Hyde realized that Frank was another of those people with an unbearable burden. Even if he did successfully expose Hugh Speck as the liar and criminal he was, the pain would probably never go away completely. Now that his order was completed, Hyde gave Ed his assistance that he'd be straight back to work the next day. It was time to pull all his effort into sales for a change.